The year was 1892, and the fog that descended over southern Chile that March was unlike any the elders remembered. Not the usual morning veil that burned off by noon, but a dense, lingering weight that clung to the pines and choked the ridges around Mission San Ezequiel, a Jesuit outpost so remote that even government cartographers had left it off the newer maps. The mission sat atop a weather-scarred bluff overlooking a narrow inlet where the sea came not to roar but to whisper, pulling in strange birds and stranger winds, and it had endured for nearly 70 years, long enough that its weathered cross had sunken into the chapel roof like a nail driven too far, and the worn feet of its stone saints were rubbed smooth by generations of prayers and fear. Built originally as a base for religious outreach into the Mapuche heartland, the mission had evolved over time into a compound of caution, a school, a chapel, a mill, a modest infirmary, and quarters for its small community of Jesuit priests, lay nuns, and apprentices who had traded the roar of Santiago for the stillness of distant hills. The local population was scarce, but the school was the mission's pride. 42 children, most born of Mapuche mothers and Spanish fathers, quiet, obedient, bright-eyed in the way of children who still believed suffering had meaning. These children worked the soil by day and read from Latin primers by candlelight, their prayers stitched into the wind like embroidery. Their schoolhouse, a long wooden structure flanked by crude stone columns, stood just north of the chapel. Each dusk, at exactly 5 o'clock, the brass bell atop the school would ring once to signal the end of studies, and children would pour out like dandelion seeds, laughing, shoving, reciting verses, their bare feet slapping against the stones before vanishing into the fog-draped gardens and shared dormitories beyond. It was a ritual as consistent as breath. But on the evening of April 4th, when the bell rang, no children emerged. Not one. The sound had echoed as it always did, clear, full, unmistakable, and those nearby, including Sister Eugenia and Brother Armando, had smiled at the familiar cue. But minutes passed, then more. The silence after the bell grew thick. There were no footsteps, no giggles, no rushed words in broken Spanish or Quechua, just the fog, which had not lifted in days, and a growing unease that made even the birds still. Sister Catalina, the schoolmistress, was known for her unbending schedule and stricter morals, but not for cruelty or neglect. She herself had grown up in the mission, orphaned by disease and schooled under the very cross she now taught beneath. As the silence persisted, the priests exchanged glances and sent Brother Armando, the stout and skeptical groundskeeper, to check. He walked the short distance to the schoolhouse, his boots crunching the gravel path with the confidence of routine, and knocked on the large oak door with the back of his knuckle. "Sister Catalina?" he called, then again louder. No reply. He tried the door. It was locked. Not strange, Sister Catalina was careful, but still unusual this long after the bell. He went to retrieve the iron ring of keys from the vestry. When he returned and tried them, none worked. He tested them twice, then 3 times. The lock clicked, but did not yield. The door creaked, as if breathing, but would not open. Frowning, he called for assistance, and soon a group of laborers and 2 other priests joined him. They struck the door with a mallet, then a crowbar. It groaned and split down the center, revealing the hollow dark within. They entered, and what they found, or rather what they didn't, froze them. The desks were neatly arranged. The children's slates were clean and dry. Small coats hung on wall pegs. Lunch pails sat, some half full. The room had the stillness of a stage between acts. But there were no children, no Sister Catalina, no signs of panic or struggle. No screams had been heard. No windows were open. The blackboard had been wiped clean. A lesson on Psalms, perhaps, had been written there earlier, but now it stood blank, as though erased mid-sentence. A faint smell of sandalwood incense clung to the air, but nothing more. They searched every corner, under desks, inside cupboards, behind the wooden altar. But the schoolhouse was empty. A head count confirmed the worst. All 42 pupils and the schoolmistress were unaccounted for. They searched the surrounding fields. Nothing. No footprints. The ground was damp from morning rain, but undisturbed, as if no one had stepped upon it. It was as if the building had exhaled and the children had vanished with the breath. Panic, at first, was quiet. The nuns began lighting candles in the chapel. The priests whispered of Mapuche raids, though the local tribes had long abandoned hostility. Others whispered darker things, that the bell should not have rung, that something had entered with the fog, that the forest had watched too long. Brother Tomas suggested that the children had fled, perhaps in mischief. But how, when the only door had been locked, the windows shut, and the key untouched? By morning, the story had already grown claws. Messages were sent to Valdivia, and then to Santiago. 3 days later, a letter arrived from the bishop's office, demanding details. Another letter, penned by Father Luis, recorded what others feared to say aloud. We lost our children like coins down a holy well. They are not gone into the forest. The forest came for them. The remaining clergy, now sleep-deprived and guilt-stricken, divided their time between prayer and searching, but their hope soured into dread. Sister Eugenia began to hear whispers at night. Giggling, she said, from the chapel rafters. Brother Armando swore he heard the school bell ring twice after midnight, though no one had touched the rope. On April 9th, the mission's oldest nun, Sister Marisol, collapsed during Vespers, clutching her rosary so tightly it left blood on her palms. She let them sing it, the woman cried before fainting. No one understood what it was. No one asked. Father Luis burned her bedding and sprinkled ash across the school threshold. By the end of that week, the schoolhouse was boarded shut. But still, no one left. Perhaps it was duty. Perhaps it was shame. But the mission, with its hollow school and absent voices, remained occupied. The fog, too, remained, denser now, like a curtain unwilling to lift. On April 13th, the wind changed. For the first time in days, it came from the west, from the sea. A boy's shoe washed up on the inlet shore. It was dry. Beside it, drawn into the sand with a stick or finger, was a circle with 42 small lines radiating outward, like rays of a sun or spokes of a wheel. No one claimed to understand it, but Sister Eugenia began covering her ears whenever the bell tower swayed in the wind. "It rings even when it doesn't," she whispered to the infirmarian. "It rings inside the skin." On April 20th, when representatives from the bishopric finally arrived, 2 men in dark coats with long scrolls of questions and sealed sacramental orders, the mission looked no different from the outside. The trees still swayed. The buildings still stood. But something beneath the surface had been hollowed out, as if grief had gnawed its way through the foundations. The bell was inspected. It bore no markings except a faint inscription in Latin, Veniet qui non audet loci. He shall come who dares not speak. The records show that one of the inspectors asked whether the bell had always been there. Brother Tomas said yes. Father Luis said no. When asked what became of the previous bell, no one had an answer. It was as if the new one had appeared, already mounted, already used, already. 80 too late. On April 25th, after a month of silence, a child's voice echoed briefly across the stone courtyard during sunrise prayers. Sister Eugenia screamed. The others froze. But it did not come again. The voice had said only one word. Still, as if responding to a roll call, as if present, but none came forward. The schoolhouse remained empty, the desks undisturbed, the coats still hanging. And somewhere far above, hidden in fog, the bell hung crooked on its rope, waiting. 2 weeks had passed since the bell rang, and the children of Mission San Ezequiel disappeared without footprints or farewell. And in that time the fog had not once lifted its grip from the chapel spire, nor had a single bird flown over the compound, nor had a single priest spoken the children's names aloud more than once, before averting their eyes to the floor. The silence had metastasized, not just in the schoolhouse, which remained boarded and unopened since the April night the pupils vanished, but in the air itself, a charged absence that made even the old stone walls feel like they were listening. When the bishopric finally responded in earnest, sending both religious authority and skeptical intellect, they arrived not with swords or soldiers, but with scrolls, candles, and a man named Dr. Hector Valdivieso, whose reputation as a physician and scholar of mental disturbances and unexplainable phenomena preceded him. A tall, pale man, with eyes too tired for someone under 40, Dr. Valdivieso had studied the intersection of indigenous ritual, trauma, and delusion, and, while the Church preferred his findings quiet, it often called on him when conventional explanations were exhausted. He arrived with 2 assistants and a trunk full of instruments, measuring sticks, small flasks, brushes for dirt, and a battered, leather-bound codex that appeared more sacred than scientific. From the moment he stepped onto the Guian, Revel courtyard, he noted what others hadn't: the absence of echo. His footfalls made sound, but it died a few feet from him, swallowed into the mist as if the very landscape were engineered to absorb the truth. The remaining clergy, 8 priests, a dozen sisters, and a handful of lay workers, were reluctant to help. They were sunken, sleepless, wary of questions they had already asked themselves too many times in private. And, though they gave answers when compelled, it was Sister Magdalena who drew Dr. Valdivieso's attention. Elderly, hunched, and blind in one eye, she had taught Latin hymns for 30 years, and now wandered the chapel corridors muttering phrases that chilled the blood of even the most faith-hardened priests. She shouldn't have taught them the black hymn, she said one night. They told her not to. Who told her? Who was she? Dr. Valdivieso asked gently, but the old nun only stared at him with her one good eye and whispered, "They're not lost, Doctor. They're somewhere you won't name." That night he stood alone in the schoolhouse. With permission, He'd had the doors unsealed, and while the others stood outside crossing themselves, he moved between the desks, brushing dust from the floor, noting the curious stillness. Nothing rotted, nothing broken. Even insects seemed to have abandoned the building. He tapped along the wood planks with a brass rod, not expecting what he found. A hollow chamber beneath the floor, not marked on any mission plans. Over the next day, his team carefully lifted the planks, revealing a rough, circular stone structure beneath, barely 5 feet below the school's foundation. The stonework was older than anything else on the property. Primitive, pre-Jesuit, perhaps even pre-Mapuche. Inside the circular pit were dozens of small objects, some burned, some wrapped in decayed animal hide, bowls carved from bone, red-painted masks with no mouths, teeth strung together in necklaces, small figurines of bent figures with missing faces, a language, a warning, a theology. The symbols were not Quechua, not Incan, not even Araucanian. He took sketches. He cross-referenced them with his codex. They bore similarity to legends whispered by the oldest southern tribes, fragments of a near-mythic people sometimes called Los Silenciados, or the Silenced Ones, a name rarely spoken even among shamans. The legend went that they had been a singing tribe once, until their voices summoned something they could not send back. So they made a pact, silence, forever, in exchange for protection. They buried their songs in dirt, carved their prayers into flesh, and taught their children never to speak under moonlight. Dr. Valdivieso, disturbed, tried to interview Sister Magdalena again. This time, she was in bed, unable to rise. Feverish, clutching a page from a hymnal. She stared into nothing, lips trembling. "It wasn't that they were taken," she whispered. "It's that they answered. Catalina let them sing. That was the door." Then she shuddered, her breath caught, and she died. When the sisters tried to pull the hymnal page from her hand, they found it wrapped around something. The bell clapper from the schoolhouse, bound in black linen and stained with what looked like dried sap or blood. When they returned to the school tower, the bell was still hanging, but the clapper was gone. It had been in her possession for days. Who had rung the bell 2 nights before then? Or had it rung on its own? Dr. Valdivieso, now in the grip of equal parts fascination and dread, returned to the circular pit. What he noticed on his second visit made his stomach turn. Around the interior edge, something had marked 40-30 chalk outlines, evenly spaced. Not lines like for measurements. Not for symbols. They were footprints, child-sized, facing inward, as if they had stood there willingly. No drag marks, no blood. Just the impression, faint, but undeniably human. And beside them, etched in the stone, a crude version of the belled tower, a triangle with a circle above, scratched over with a diagonal line. A negation, a seal, a curse. That night, 3 of Dr. Valdivieso's team fled the mission in secret, walking 6 miles before sunrise to the nearest town and boarding a steamer north. They would never write of what they saw. But Dr. Valdivieso stayed. And so did the whispers. The chapel, once solemn, now felt heavy with breath. At dusk, during Mass, The sound of faint children's voices, too faint to be located, but clear enough to be real, began to rise beneath the chapel floorboards. The priests halted the service. They listened. The verses the voices recited were unfamiliar, Latin in tone, but not in form. Repetitions of phrases that sounded like invocations, but out of sequence, as if the children were practicing a language not meant for liturgy. That same night, one nun confessed privately to Der Valdivieso that 2 weeks before the disappearance, Sister Catalina had changed the curriculum. She had introduced a song, an old tune, she said, passed down orally from a traveler priest who had served in the Andes. It wasn't in any hymnal, the nun said. She taught them by humming it, then gave them the words. The words, the nun claimed, were in no known language. But the children liked it, she added, too much. They sang it without instruction. They sang it in their sleep. And then, one day, they were gone. Dr. Valdivieso documented everything. He copied the markings. He collected samples. He sealed the bell clapper in wax and packed it in a wooden crate. But as he read over his notes the following morning, he found one new line, not written in his hand. Don't open the pit again. The ink was fresh. The paper from his journal. But no one admitted to writing it. The pit was resealed, the floor restored, the chapel scrubbed. But the voices continued. Quietly, then only in dreams. Then not at a moa, but the silence they left behind was worse. By July of 1892, the mission of San Ezequiel no longer echoed with prayer, no longer steamed with the warmth of bread or hymns, or barefoot children chasing between carved stone columns. For by then, even the sun seemed to avoid that stretch of coastal land where pine needles hung limp and the fog clung to wood like wet wool. And what once was sacred had become quietly cursed. After the disappearance of all 42 children and the death of Sister Magdalena, after the pit beneath the schoolhouse had been discovered and then sealed again, and after Dr. Hector Valdivieso's team withdrew without comment and without returning, the clergy remaining at the mission dissolved their presence, not in a ceremony or official announcement, but with the slow, terrified stillness of people who knew something had crossed a threshold and could not be undone. One by one, the nuns left under the guise of reassignment. The priests took their final confessions under their breath, and when the bishop's men arrived to reconsecrate the grounds with fire, salt, and scripture. Even they found themselves hesitating at the chapel door, the very air humming with something ancient and listening, as though to speak aloud would be to awaken something still kneeling in prayer far beneath the soil. Livestock brought to the grounds refused to pass the gate. Birds avoided the roofs as if seeing something humans couldn't. And the final report filed to Santiago was short and clinical, stamped, closed by papal directive, as if words might silence memory, as if Vatican ink could bury 43 vanished lives under theological bureaucracy. But not everyone accepted the closure. And in the early autumn of that same year, when the fog turned thinner but no less strange and the rain began to return to the cliffs in thick sheets like a curtain drawing shut, a man named Arturo Lopez, a former archivist turned private investigator, arrived at the crumbling gates of San Ezequiel with a small leather satchel, a rusted lantern, and a letter of commission signed by 3 families of the missing children who had never received bodies, explanations, or peace. Arturo was not a man of religion, but of records, once employed to catalog property disputes for the Jesuits in Santiago. until he began noticing discrepancies in land plots around former missions, plots that correlated with disappearances, forgotten wells, and unexplained silences in the church's archives. And though dismissed for curiosity unbecoming, he had made a quiet living collecting those stories no one else wanted to investigate. Stories that stuck to places like mildew, orphaned bells that rang by themselves, baptisms with missing priests, letters written by dead hands in ink that faded when read aloud. And now, the mystery of San Ezekiel, which he approached not with fear, but with a hunger to understand the pattern, the rot beneath the ritual. What he found upon arriving was less than ruins, but more than memory. Buildings intact but empty. Doors that creaked but did not resist. Air that smelled not of decay but of waiting, and in the schoolhouse, though the floor had been reboarded and sealed, Arturo felt it immediately, like a hum through the soles of his boots, a pulse too low to be heard but too steady to be natural. And when he sat at one of the child-sized desks, opening his journal and noting the dimensions of the room, he began to sweat though the air was cold, and the shadows along the ceiling seemed to stretch unnaturally long, flickering not with the lantern's flame, but with his own breath, as if he had exhaled and something above him moved in reply. For 3 days, Arturo stayed at the mission, sleeping in the mill house, eating only bread and hard cheese, and spending each day taking readings with a compass. A maze that spun erratically inside the schoolhouse and a pendulum that stilled unnaturally under the bell tower. He wrote every detail down, including that during the second night he woke to the sound of chalk against slate, slow, deliberate, like a hand tracing ancient letters with infinite patience, though the school's slate boards had long been erased and dry. He lit his lantern and followed the sound into the chapel, but found nothing. Only that when he turned back, the altar crucifix had been turned upside down, not forcefully, but with the careful reverence of someone offering a correction. On the 4th day, he returned to the schoolhouse with tools, determined to investigate beneath the floor despite warnings from locals and the thin letters he'd reviewed from Dr. Valdivieso, who had recorded only this phrase near the end of his last entry. There is something under the pit that does not wait to be found. It waits to be remembered. A strange turn of phrase that Arturo couldn't shake, and as he pried the boards loose one by one, he felt each nail come free like a breath held too long. When the final plank lifted, and the stone pit lay exposed once more, he descended into it with care, finding again the chalk circles, the red markings, the offerings of carved bone and eyeless masks. But he also felt something else. A pulling, not physical but mental, like a thought trying to finish itself in his head, like the moment before a name is spoken or a song is remembered. And then he saw what Valdivieso had not recorded. A seam in the stone, faint but present, running in a perfect circle at the base of the pit, suggesting a hatch or boundary or floor, and when Arturo pressed gently against it, the stone breathed, not moved, not groaned, but breathed, as if what lay beneath was not dead but dreaming. He staggered back, bleeding from the nose, dizzy with nausea and shaking hands, and in that moment he swore he saw the chalk outlines glow faintly, and in the corner of his vision, children, dozens of them, not walking, not moving, but standing, mouths open, eyes closed. Mote dies, faint and humming. Not ghosts, not echoes, but presences, as though time itself had curled into that space and preserved them, not as memory, but as possibility. One of them turned toward him, a girl with no whites in her eyes, and in a voice that was not voice but understanding. She spoke in broken Latin, not fluent, not beautiful, but like a child mimicking prayers she only half comprehended. And the words that reached him, clear and final, were, "Don't speak. We are already heard." He fled then, crawling out of the pit, sealing it again with trembling fingers, and recording the experience in a small black notebook, which would not be found until 1956, hidden inside a false-bottom drawer in an archive office in Valparaiso, after renovations revealed a cache of unfiled documents wrapped in oilskin and rosaries. His notebook ends not with conclusions, but with a final reflection. There is a room under the school that was never built. I saw it, but it did not see me. It is made of voices and shadows, and it remembers. And after his visit, no further search parties were sent, no clergy returned, and San Ezequiel was finally left to decay, moss consuming the chapel stone by stone, the bell tower leaning at a soft angle, and in 1903 a landslide buried the schoolhouse entirely during a thunderstorm that killed no one and injured nothing but the mission itself, as if the land had decided to fold the story back into itself like a letter, no longer meant to be read. Yet for decades afterward, villagers and travelers alike reported that every 10 years, near the equinox, a single bell would ring at dusk from the cliffside where the school once stood. Not two, not three, just once. Deep, metallic, soft with distance, and those who heard it often dreamt of the same thing in the weeks to come. A chalk circle, a teacher with no eyes, and a classroom of still children who were not waiting to be saved, but waiting for you to join them.